We are honored by the presence of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Good afternoon. Ms. Sendai Takeichi, Minister of Internal Affairs and Communications of Japan. Distinguished heads of state and government, distinguished ministers, distinguished representatives of intergovernment organizations, United Nations agencies and major groups, distinguished panelists for this afternoon, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I call to order the first high-level multi-stakeholder partnership dialogue of the Third United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. Let me take this opportunity to cordially welcome all of you to this dialogue. I am honored to serve as your co-chair, together with Her Excellency Sendai Takeichi, Minister of Internal Affairs and Communications of Japan. The topic of our deliberation is mobilizing women's leadership in disaster risk reduction. We'll present a summary or reflections, recommendations of this afternoon's session after the closing plenary meeting of the conference in the morning of Wednesday, March 18. We are also pleased to inform the participants that Mr. Riz Khan, international journalist, formerly affiliated with Al Jazeera English, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, and CNN, will serve as our moderator this afternoon. Before we proceed, I would like to make some introductory remarks about the theme of our discussions today. Ten years ago, the Yogo Framework for Action was adopted by 168 countries at the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Yogo, Japan, effectively putting a spotlight on the need to shift our approach from disaster relief and response to building the resilience of communities to disasters. Today, we come together to put focus on the leadership roles for women in national disaster risk reduction efforts. Gender mainstreaming is already an agreed principle. We need not just remain faithful to this belief, we also need to take urgent action. I speak not just as an advocate, but as a person who shares the sad reality of a region that accounted for 41% of the world's natural disasters over the past 10 years. These disasters have been unforgiving, claiming an average of 70,000 lives each year from 2004 to 2013. Another 200 million are affected each year, half of them women and girls. Although disasters do not discriminate between men and women, the young and old, the rich and poor, they impact on individuals and families disproportionately, with the strong and capable surviving and coping better, and the weak and the vulnerable suffering the most from loss of lives and property. In times of disasters, women face great risks. The facts are glaring. In the 2004 Asian tsunami, women accounted for 70% of the deaths in Aceh, Indonesia, and in parts of India. More women than men died during the 2003 European heatwave. Most of the victims trapped in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina were African-American women and children. And in my very own country, Haiyan revealed the vulnerability of women to disasters. 3.5 million women were affected. Even after disasters, women are at greater risk. Pregnant and lactating women have special needs which are often neglected during disasters. Women are more prone to sexual abuse, trafficking, and other forms of violence in the aftermath of disasters. These realities show that even in disaster impacts, there is no equality. As women have a greater stake in disaster realities, it is time we take action by putting women at the forefront of disaster risk reduction efforts. Women's vulnerability in times of disasters is not a showcase of weakness, but rather highlights the inequality that exists. Women have lesser access to resources and information. Gendered social roles and cultural constraints on either actions continue to persist in many societies. Lower level of education among women prevent them from understanding disaster warnings, thus preventing them from taking precautionary measures. The first step in addressing this vulnerability is to change the way we view the women in the context of disaster realities. Women are not victims. They constitute a formidable first line of defense against disaster risks. We must acknowledge the capacity of women to get involved, decide to take action, and to lead. Our goal should be not only to reduce women's vulnerability, but to empower and allow women to become part of disaster risk reduction and management efforts, thereby addressing the risks that they face. We acknowledge that the HFA has become a tool in making DRR more participatory and inclusive, but there are continuing challenges as gender and social inequalities persist. More women hold paid jobs in non-agricultural sectors, but the increase is slow. 35% way back in 1990, women's access to paid employment 2 years ago has only increased to only 40%. We cannot change the circumstances overnight, but these are factors we must consider in our approaches to make women effective agents of disaster risk reduction. How do we make uneducated girls part of the strategy while we strive to give them access to education? How do we make DRR leaders out of our women, even as we struggle to provide access to fair employment to them in some sectors of our society? How can our women lead in DRR efforts when social cultural norms restrict their movements? Unless we find solutions to these fundamental issues, our call for women leadership in DRR efforts will be futile. The present task of reducing disaster risks in the context of a changing global climate and the prevailing gender imbalances and insensitivities in our societies has become synonymous to securing humanity and the future of our children and our grandchildren today. In the face of increasing disaster and climate risks, national and local development processes must involve women actively. Stereotyped gendered roles have no place in the critical fight against disaster risk and climate change. Through this forum today, we want to be able to contribute to making the post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction a document that would not only urge nations to mobilize women's leadership in DRR, but also guide them on how this commitment could be effectively carried out. We want HFA2 to be a tool towards a dramatic shift in the degree and scope of women's involvement in climate change and disaster risk reduction efforts. From the quiet but steady work they perform in their communities, women should move into the front lines of delivering decisive action towards a sustainable and resilient planet. Thank you.